Hello, and welcome to tonight's live chapter reading of Caine, Men of Sin, Book 2 by Anise Storm. Brought to you by Itsy Bitsy Book Beds. Chapter 1. Glancing in the rearview mirror of his charcoal 06 Mustang GT, Caine Stevens watched the Washington, D.C. skyline disappear into the darkness behind him. This particular city was one he didn't care to lay eyes on ever again. After spending practically his entire life in the godforsaken place, it was time for a change. Granted, this relocation wasn't entirely his choice, but he'd learned long ago that things seldom went according to plan. They never had for Caine, or other outcasts he knew. After taking a final glance out the window, his right hand moved to the Beretta Storm beside him, which he tucked between the seats. Men like him were surrounded by danger, living entirely by the eye for an eye creed. The difference between him and most who dared to challenge him, however, was the simple fact that when the gunshots died down, he'd damn sure be the last one standing. His life had been that way for as long as he could remember. Having spent his entire childhood being shipped from one foster home to another, he'd learned at a young age how to defend himself, and defense was something that he excelled in. There was something else he'd mastered over the years, but right now, he had no time for women. Maybe once he got to his destination, he'd rethink that particular aspect. Sin, he'd asked Hawk when his lifelong friend had told him he'd opened his own club in Denver. Are you sure you want to go there, man? Hawk had laughed his question off, but Caine knew, deep down, he'd known what he'd meant. After all, some evils were best kept hidden, and if the man was anything like he'd been over the last 13 years, he was sure the past was still buried where it rightfully belonged. There were things never meant to be endured, but as with everything else in his life, breaks were not something Caine Stevens or Nathaniel Hawkins ever seemed to catch. He couldn't speak for his friend at the present time, but he could for himself. The shit kept hitting the fan and was the driving force in his trading, the only place he'd ever lived into a life on the run. Denver, he said aloud. What the hell had Hawk been thinking when he opened a club there, of all places? That question was one that could be answered upon his arrival. For now, he still had a long damn drive ahead of him. Thank fuck it was after midnight. The darkness would allow him to forget the last few hours and focus on next steps. The flash of orange on his dashboard indicating he was nearly out of fuel caught his attention. Caine looked straight ahead and slowed his speed just enough to see that he'd reached the Bethesda city limits in about 10 miles. He'd fill up his gas tank and grab a bite to eat. From there, it'd be 20-something hours until he reached Colorado. Shaking his head once again, he could only continue to question his friend's choice of locations. A lot had changed in the last year with both, and outside of reuniting with Hawk in Denver, there was only one other thing on his mind. Hopefully, he wouldn't need to be there longer than a few weeks. Caine had often thought about crossing the border into Mexico, and the urge was still prevalent in his head. For now, he'd have to settle with changing lanes, crossing swiftly over two of them until he was in the far right one. His exit was quickly approaching, and after taking it, he was relieved to see an all-night diner inside one of the gas stations. Maneuvering his clunker into the parking lot, he cursed at the sounds emanating from beneath the hood. He hoped the damn vehicle made it to Colorado. Removing the keys from the ignition, he glanced out the side mirrors before reaching for his gun. Caine leaned over in his seat, opened his glove compartment, and slipped the weapon inside. Aside from the two duffel bags he'd quickly packed a few hours earlier, his Glock was the only other item he'd managed to grab before hastily leaving town. Exiting the vehicle, he walked toward the diner, making sure to look over his shoulder as he crossed the parking lot. Some habits were hard to break, and after what happened a few hours earlier, he had plenty of reasons to be paranoid. It'd only be a matter of time before he became suspect number one. It was inevitable, and not anything he wasn't already used to. Tonight's exception was that he wouldn't be spending time in a jail cell. I just have to get to fucking Lodo and stay out of sight, he mumbled under his breath as he stepped inside the diner. Are you by yourself this evening? The female hostess asked him. Yeah, he replied in a lot gruffer tone than he'd intended. Clearing his throat, he added, "Can I sit somewhere in the back?" "Certainly, sir. Follow me." She responded, and he walked behind her. Besides a few patrons in a nearby booth, the restaurant was completely empty, which suited him just fine. He didn't have the time or desire to make idle chit-chat anyway. He still had a long way to drive, and then had the inevitable task of finding a place to crash when he finally did reach his destination. Caine sat down and took the menu, nodding as the woman rambled off the name of his waitress. When she left his table, he picked up the laminated page and skimmed through the offerings. He needed to find something quick to eat, and when the aforementioned waitress arrived at his table, he already knew what he wanted. "Good evening, sir. My name is Maddie. Tonight's special are—" "That isn't necessary," he interrupted. "I'll take a cheeseburger, fries, and a large Pepsi." The blonde nodded before leaving to enter his order. While he waited for his food to be delivered, Caine pulled his cell phone out of his pocket to retrieve his text messages. He was waiting for one from Hawk, but hadn't received anything since the last one he'd sent a few days ago. What the hell is going on? "Here you go, sir. Your food will be ready shortly," Maddie said when she reappeared with his drink. Caine gave a curt nod and then watched the woman as she walked away. On any other day, he might have flirted or at least talked to her more, but the less conspicuous he was, the better. Eventually, his face would be plastered all over the local news, so the least amount of attention he could draw to himself was to his benefit. Of course, that was assuming they'd actually discovered what he'd recently found out regarding his father. "Fuck," he cursed before raking his hands through his hair. "Who would have ever guessed my birth father has been in Washington, D.C. my entire life?" As Caine was shuffled from one hellhole foster home to another, he could have been living well in Capitol Hill. Having grown up the way he had would have been enough to make a weaker man snap. But Caine had taken it all in stride. Eventually, the sins of one past always caught up with them, and for Andrew Carmichael, that'd been tonight. How much longer would it be before Caine could say the same about his own? His thoughts were interrupted when his food arrived. Caine had seen better fare before, but right now he'd work with what he had before heading west. The fries were soggy and the burger overcooked, but he forced himself to eat as much as he could before he settled his tab. He had gotten nearly all the way back to his car when he remembered needing to refuel. He reversed course and walked back into the store. The place was pretty dead, but considering the time of night, it wasn't surprising. There was one other person as he stood behind the older man. Caine's attention was drawn to the small television off to the side. The late night news was airing a story on his father, and he froze as his silhouette was displayed across the screen. Discreetly, Caine raised the hood on his sweatshirt over his head and prayed that neither the cashier nor the other customer looked over at the television. Thankfully, neither appeared to, and when the man walked away, the female cashier smiled. "50 on pump 4, he told her before tossing the bill onto the counter. He didn't linger, needing to hurry up and get as far away from DC as he possibly could. Once he was back at his car, he refueled and then got back onto the highway. By this time tomorrow, his new life would begin, whether he was ready for it or not. Chapter 2. Rolling over in bed, Caine groaned as the alarm on his cell phone chimed repeatedly. Fumbling around for the damn thing, he finally found it and pressed the snooze button. He'd arrived in Denver during the wee hours of the morning. Not wanting to wake up Hawk, he'd found a nondescript place that would rent to him, no questions asked. There was no way he'd leave a paper trail, so he'd paid for the extended stay suite in cash, sight unseen. Now as he opened his eyes, Caine realized what a mistake that'd been. Beside the fact that the air conditioner barely pushed out a cool breeze, the place was one of the worst he'd ever seen. Surely he could have done better. Too little, too late, he muttered as he sat up in bed. He was paid up through the next 2 weeks. Hopefully that he wouldn't need to be in Colorado any longer than that. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows, so once on his feet, Caine staggered over to the window to close the dusty blinds. He turned around and grimaced at his surroundings. On second thought, he'd been somewhere as bad once or twice before. Raking his hands through his hair, he crossed the room and looked at the small counter, which had an old coffee maker sitting on top. There was no telling how old the small appliance was, or if the coffee packets sitting beside it were even any good. Caine decided against making a cup. It wasn't that early anyway. He'd walked back toward the bed and picked up his phone. It was late afternoon, so it would be a few hours before he was needed at Sin. As he thought back to the night before, he was glad his friend had finally responded to his latest series of text messages and set up a time to meet. Caine hated to drag Hawk into his own drama, but no one else would be willing to help him. The two of them had forged a bond the years had only strengthened. That was until he moved here to Denver to open up his own BDSM club. Their relationship was more like that of brothers, and for a long time, they were the only family each other had. Everything changed for Hawk, however, when he met Charlotte Maxwell. While Caine didn't know the specifics of their arrangement, even he'd always known it was simply a matter of time before the man found someone to share his life with. I doubt that day would ever come for me. And it was the truth. Caine had always considered himself a loner, and the recent discovery of his true parentage did little to change that. Even if he'd changed his mind and wanted to get to know the man who sired him, it was too late. The only way he'd get to know Andrew Carmichael now would be when they both reunited in hell. AC, as he was known on the streets, had met his fate at the long end of a shotgun. It wasn't a weapon Caine owned, but it might as well have been. He had means, motive, and opportunity, and if it hadn't been for a warning he'd received the afternoon before, odds were he'd be locked up, considered guilty until ultimately proven innocent. Of course, that was assuming the jury actually believed him. Fuck that, he cursed loudly. There was no way he'd ever put his life into the hands of another, unless maybe it was Hawk. In fact, his presence in Denver was doing that in a way. Caine hoped his old friend would give him some work so he could score some fast cash and something he'd be able to do behind the scenes to not risk detection. He'd been able to work on clearing his name in case that didn't work. He would have made enough cash to disappear into Mexico and start anew. Until then, it was time to get showered and dressed before heading to the club. He went into the small bathroom, one which was half the size of what he was normally accustomed to, and turned the faucet on. The pressure was minimal at best, and it took forever for the water to heat up. So once it had, he quickly showered, shaved, and then re-entered the room. Caine tossed the 2 duffel bags he'd brought with him on top of the bed and began pulling everything out from them. It wasn't as if he'd had a large selection of clothing to choose from, but he still looked over what he had, finally deciding on a pair of faded jeans and a Metallica t-shirt. Caine still had some time to blow off, so after looking at the dormitory-sized refrigerator, he decided to do a little shopping. Grabbing his phone and wallet, he left his room, immediately squinting once he got into the bright sunlight. As humid as it felt in the heat, he realized it was a similar temperature to that inside. Making a mental note to grab a fan while out as well, he got into his car and left. Now that he'd gotten some rest, and it was still daylight, he decided to drive around for a bit to familiarize himself with his surroundings. It was important to learn different routes to town, especially the airport and state lines. If things there went south, he'd have another few plans in mind, just as he'd always done. Caine was slightly preoccupied with those thoughts that he didn't hear the phone ringing on the seat beside him. When he finally did, he realized it was Hawk. "Hey," Caine said, glad his friend hadn't already hung up. "Are we still on to meet at 7 tonight?" "Yeah," his friend said before pausing. Caine was about to respond when Hawk added, "I was hoping you can stop in earlier. We've had a bouncer call out tonight and I could use some muscle around here." Caine smirked. Muscle was just one of those things he could provide to the members at Sin. "Sure, I need to stop by the store to get a few things for my place, but I could be there in about an hour." Hawk seemed relieved if his side was any indication. "Great, I'll see you then." The call disconnected. As Caine pulled into the department store parking lot, his idea of grocery shopping was chips and beer anyway, both which could be bought now and left in his trunk while he worked a shift at the club. He pulled into an empty space and cracked his knuckles. It felt good to do something useful. He just hoped his latest plan would be the last one he'd have to come up with for a while. It didn't take him long in the store, and after buying his own bedding, a fan, some toiletries, and refreshments, he placed them all into his trunk and then pulled out his phone to look up directions to Sin. The club was in a lower downtown area, and he was actually glad to be headed somewhere that was more of his element. He could still remember the day he and Hawk visited their first BDSM club together. It was so long ago, but at times like this, it almost felt like yesterday. They'd been boys at the time, but latched onto the lifestyle and never looked back from there. While still surprised that Hawk had made his business venture, Caine was very proud of his friend for finally breaking free of his past. He'd found himself a submissive, and knowing him the way he did, it was pretty wild how it happened. He'd often heard there was someone out there for everyone, and he guessed in his friend's case, it had been true. Will I ever be able to say the same? That's all for today. I hope you liked the chapter reading. Bye.